The Automated Podcast.
So welcome to the last monologue format episode of Automated. But before this podcast shifts towards an interview or discussion format, I wanted to briefly talk about my personal opinion as well as why this topic interests me so much. So as I mentioned last time, I've tried to be as objective as possible in every episode so far, and also leave out any kind of personal bias when representing the ideas and information of this extremely interesting topic. So what I've attempted to do over the last 24 episodes is to showcase some of the main technologies that are being implemented that can automate either parts of or the entire job, which a human worker can do across many different industries and sectors. So I hope to have given you the impression that automation isn't really confined to a specific part of our society, but is really wide-ranging. I also hope that some of the ideas presented that are connected to this mega trend of automation, such as reskilling centers, bullshit jobs, universal basic income, and of course the two possible futures of creative destruction and technological unemployment, have at least raised some further interest, or at the very least, some other questions for you. So I also presented that neither future is a determined outcome. Individual decisions and social forces can of course guide us towards one or the other, but the current path does appear to me to be more in line with human workers being displaced by the technologies that I've outlined so far. Granted, this isn't going to happen tomorrow. Even in light of the increased amount of automation being implemented during this coronavirus crisis, I don't think a significant chunk of the population across the world will be made redundant even over the next 2 to 3 years. But ultimately, I do think this is the path we are on, even as we will of course continue to see instances of creative destruction and worker augmentation through the new technologies that are coming out. I do of course see the merit in the argument that new forms of work are being continuously invented, but with the adoption of advanced automated technologies to do more and more of our physical labor, and of course AI starting to compete with our cognitive labor, I personally really don't see this specific future continuing forever. Granted, this opinion is only a snapshot of today. I am of course more than willing to change my point of view depending on the evidence as time goes on. So furthermore, this doesn't mean that I hope for this outcome to happen. I am very aware of the tremendous negative economic as well as psychological impact that this will have on millions of people across the world, especially if it were to occur rapidly and without the proper planning and policies in place. But this is also part of the reason for the existence of this podcast, right? To grow the conversation around this important topic in order to help plan for such an eventuality. I think that with the current global pandemic and, of course, the current repercussions, we can all see the problems that come about when nations, governments, and people have not properly planned for certain possible futures. But with this said, I'm happy to see that more attention has been given to this topic over the last few years. So through social media, different news headlines, even the increasing number of books and resources on the subject, as well as, of course, all the discussions that we all continue to have, there seems to be a growing sense of awareness that automation is a very real and significant trend that deserves our attention, especially in the years to come. But personally, I find the underlying impacts of automation are perhaps even more interesting than the technologies themselves. So although the constant creation of new jobs with the constant changing nature of work is valuable to understand, I think that job automation has a more profound outcome. So jobs are one of the most fundamental pillars of our modern civilization, and they are the way in which most humans survive today. So by exchanging our time for income, we feed and house our families, have access to transportation, healthcare, etc. And we even spend roughly about a third of our adult lives in our jobs. And many people even attribute their purpose or self-worth to their job. So we also use the overall increase or decrease of jobs to partly measure the entire health of a nation or even of an era. So thus, if jobs will be destroyed at a rate faster than they are created, this would mean a large-scale socioeconomic impact would follow, which can evidently be seen today with the global lockdowns destroying millions of businesses and jobs practically overnight. But with high levels of job automation, this would be brought one step further. So one of the fundamental narratives that civilization has really been following for generations would essentially dissolve, and a new narrative would need to be formed. namely the disassociation from our means of survival being based on exchanging our time for income. But what happens to our long-standing social structures where social value is tightly linked to the occupation you have? So doctors are usually seen as having more social value than, say, cashiers. But what happens when IBM's Watson or some other AI algorithm becomes able to diagnose a patient's illness more accurately, faster, and to more people across the entire world? Not to mention the paycheck that's tied to that profession. So I think the really interesting thing to consider with an automated future is the need to redesign social structures. So even the implementation of a universal basic income scheme doesn't really solve this issue. So if an ex-doctor and an ex-cashier both receive a living wage, this doesn't automatically mean that social hierarchies, value systems, and even individual perceptions of worth naturally follow. I'm not proposing solutions here, but merely raising the question, as I think this is one that is really worth thinking about. So the other, perhaps more obvious concern that is raised with job automation is the displacement of workers who are simultaneously the consumers of the products and services that jobs provide. So essentially, unemployed workers are now unable to contribute to the needed cyclical consumption that powers the economy, since they have lost their purchasing power as consumers. So universal basic income schemes have typically been put forth as a form of a stopgap measure when this economic issue is brought up. And we can certainly see this today in the emergency financial packages governments across the world are putting in place in response to the economic fallout of the lockdowns imposed by the coronavirus. Even though I completely see the value and, of course, the future need of a UBI scheme, I personally don't really see it as a perfect solution if it supports and enables the continuation of our current global economic system, which is, of course, and unfortunately, based on environmentally unsustainable practices. However, there might be hope that with this current coronavirus crisis and then the future automation crisis, which has the potential to be much larger, there might be some shift or transformation in the way in which our fundamental economic system actually works. So whether actually implemented UBI schemes will act as a full solution to this problem, however, we will have to see. So in the many discussions that I've had about technology, futurism, and society over the years, job automation often acts as kind of a first foundational point that opens and widens the exploration of future changes and transformations for both individuals and society at large. Often topics of data privacy and security, continuous economic growth and its link to resource depletion, of course, the Earth's carrying capacity, as well as social and cultural values, and even more esoteric ideas like transhumanism and the technological singularity follow from this initial concept. So though these are, of course, outside of the scope of this podcast, I think that by exploring the topic of automation, it is really easy to see how jobs, as kind of a fundamental part of our current global structure, are so closely tied to many other important issues that will really be impacting us over the course of the next few decades. So, in ending, these 25 episodes I really hope have laid down kind of a foundational structure for this topic of automation. Though I will occasionally have a solo episode if something specific comes up, or if there are a series of ideas I want to lay out. From here on, this podcast is entering kind of a second phase where interviews will be the norm from now on. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic, and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.